probably as transformational as the time that Jackie Fisher took us from sail into steam. And therefore, I think some of the partnership with industry, and I know, many partners here will say, well, your success and our success is intimately wound up. But we're going to have to work really hard at aligning our motivations and delivering in a timescale that matters. One of the things that I think has come up time and time again over the last day and a half is about speed of delivery. Now, my talking points coming to this conference were with a number of industrial partners where programs are running late. There's a good classic customer supplier type of conversation. Actually, late is both frustrating, but it's also ceding advantage against the pace of relevance. And I think we've got to get ourselves into a different kind of conversation, which will challenge both sides in a number of ways about, if we're falling late, do we abandon and go again with something completely different? Because actually we're now just falling behind. And I think we need to be willing to go into longer term partnerships that unlock creative investment cycles, but at the same time recognize that within that the iteration might lead us to genuinely change our minds, not around detailed requirements, but just a recognition that the idea that was valid 2 or 3 years ago is now in the rearview mirror. That I think for all of us is a bit of a mindset shift, but I'm up for it.
Nice, interesting. We can start taking questions, so if you could raise the lights a little, and if you want to wave your arm at me if you've got a question, otherwise I'll continue until we have one. Have we got any yet? Not yet.
Not at all.
Well, it's interesting what you just talked about, aligning our motivations, because one of the things that has emerged for me in a lot of the conversations of the last 2 days has been that slight tension between the way that procurement's been done and the need to do things differently, but equally a kind of concern that ultimately industry partners do operate kind of different motivations. And I don't know how easy it is to kind of reconcile those tensions.
This is, we sit in, a phenomenal piece of innovative engineering in this ship. It has got some incredible ideas that have helped us keep the size of the crew relatively small compared to certainly aircraft carriers operated by the Americans and the French, for instance. So there are some really interesting forward-looking ideas, and actually the journey to get us to see these or the new classes of submarines does require, I think, some really fabulous technical and engineering skills. So big projects, great. But whether or not that mindset actually takes us into the small, rapidly occurring, software-dominated, iterative, readily disposable kind of thought process, I don't know. And I suspect we would find that in a lot of defense industry, and maybe people will push back and challenge me, some of the big program complexities and the way we go about attacking them, that's not relevant in the smaller projects. We need to understand where the primes have a really key role and where the SMEs need to be allowed to flourish, because they've got that ability to move quicker, but may not necessarily know how best to dock into the broader defence architecture.
One thing I would be very interesting, I think, for all the audience, and actually to me personally, is just, it feels like the Royal Navy, in terms of the demands on it, in the world, it's just never been busier. Whether it was, how long have Russian vessels, whether it's submarines or ships, been kind of turning up at unexpected places, and the Royal Navy has to handle that appropriately. But equally with issues like migrants in sea crossings, can you give some insights into some of the challenges that the Royal Navy's been dealing with over the last year or so, and what you expect looking ahead?
So the thing that's really exciting for me, but possibly the thing that's going to be most challenging, is we've been tasked to get bigger. And that growth agenda, both in range of tasking, size of the fleet, global reach is something that for the previous 20 years has tended not to be in our DNA or even further back. And I'm absolutely confident that once we've kind of got over the shyness of recognizing that growth is a perfectly allowable process rather than can you do the same with less or more with the same, but actually can you do more with more, which is where the Prime Minister's commitment to 3% of GDP is going to take us, let alone the investment in shipbuilding and in the increases in tonnage in the pipeline. That I think is going to create real opportunity and liberate potential, particularly from the young people who are going to be taking the service through into the years ahead. So I find that tremendously exciting. I'm also struck by, when you look at our contribution into the migrant process, some of the challenges around critical national infrastructure on the seabed that's going on at the moment, how we're being much
just
more
remind us what critical national infrastructure is.
So we're talking about undersea cables. You know, so much of our economy at some point or another finds itself moving through undersea cables in terms of the financial aspects. Let alone, as Anne-Marie Trevelyan said earlier today, you know, over 90% of kind of the stuff moving by sea. When you look at the increased role of the Royal Navy as part of the prosperity agenda, and you know, being allowed comfortably to be part of a kind of national prosperity and growth and economic story around the world, in part driven by, you know, this kind of the post-Brexit response. All of that is forcing us to break out of something which for a long period was Euro-Atlantic and Middle East fixed against some fairly well-established norms. Those norms haven't necessarily gone away. We've just got some more added into the mix. And that, I think, is going to just take us some time to genuinely find our stride about how we adapt it. At the moment, it can feel that, you know, the wind is buffeting from various directions at the same time.
You don't ever feel that you're sort of spread a bit thin in terms of all the demands and expectations made on the Royal Navy that actually you're wanted here and there, I mean, literally in different places.
And it's great to be wanted. I mean, let's you know, don't for any moment think I'm shying away from this challenge or not. I think it's really exciting. But for the best part of 2 decades, the security mindset was dominated by, for UK, by our obligations in NATO, defence mindset, our obligations in NATO, and our lay down in the Middle East. And the Middle East was, you know, characterised by our response, our contribution against to counter violent extremist organisations. In the last 2 to 3 years, that narrative has fundamentally changed, and that has given the maritime a kind of profile and an exposure, which is exciting for us. But we're still learning to respond to that with confidence, I think, in a broader narrative. It's a great time to be the First Sea Lord, and I recently briefed the retired First Sea Lord community, and there was an admitted tinge of envy amongst them all that we find ourselves in this position.
How big is the retired Sea Lord community, out of interest?
Yeah, it's fine. They were all supportive.
Yeah, I know, but like, how many of you are there?
By tonnage. By tonnage. I think by age. by age.
I love it's like a kind of, you know, there's all that wisdom there too.
There's a huge amount of wisdom. They were very decent, and I recognise that the Chief of the General Staff will have his equivalent sitting where they recognise that they're not leading the service, they're there to support. But they had some perspectives or advice on, you know, lessons that are timeless. And that was, I appreciated that counsel.
Yeah, is there anything like that you can share of a timeless lesson? I was just thinking, I remember once interviewing a naval captain who'd been involved in the Cod Wars with Iceland, when, you know, ships were being rammed, he had photographs of the damage being done. It was, you know, one of those situations which doesn't seem dissimilar to some of the situations Royal Navies found themselves in recent years with, you know, say with Russian vessels, you know, in the Baltic Sea or whatever. And I just wondered if there are any sort of basic lessons about like that, about psychology almost, that work between the generations.
I think that, and I'm going to reflect that we're 40 years on from still this year, you know, we had the sort of 40 years on from the Falklands War, and although So Henry Leach is no longer with us. One of the themes that came out of that conversation was, am I really clear at that moment when the eyes will turn upon me and say, what can the Navy do? Now, Henry Leach was very clear in 1982 that the Prime Minister was looking for an answer, and he was prepared to take that risk and go for it. And so the conversations are around that, not in the sense of if we're asked to go and rescue the Falklands again, but am I clear at that point where you exercise that kind of principal maritime advisor to the Secretary of State? And that was really interesting, because you can play a bit fast and loose if you're not careful. But that was a strategic moment for the service, and he was ready for it when it arrived. And there were one or two other bits and pieces, but I'm going to keep my own counsel on that.
Absolutely. Right, questions. I'll take a question from Anne first, then I'll come to the one in front. Thank you.
Admiral, thanks for your leadership and for all that you're doing with the Royal Navy and the great partnership for a long time with the United States Navy. You made a comment that you're being asked now to maybe grow. It seems that you're in a wonderful opportunity here to grow from almost not having things that you first need to get rid of. What is your thinking about the strategic moment in front of you to grow differently, and what does that look like to you?
Thank you.
So grow differently at its heart is going to be about the sort of people that the Navy has in the future. And I'm really clear about that. We have a lot of conversations about, the nature of ships, the nature of technology, but at our heart, we're a people organization. And what we need to really think about is what sort of people does the future Navy need to have space for, and how, therefore, do we need to change our current policy setup? And we own all our own policies. How do we need to change our policy setup so that we encourage and facilitate those different ways of thinking, rather than inhibit them in a kind of a straitjacket because we've always done it like this? And I think we haven't at all got our heads round the sort of fundamental changes that we need to bring into that. That could be the way we pay people differently. That could be being much more creative in the branch structures. That's going to, we're quite a rank and baubles focused organisation. That actually just might not matter in the future. It'll matter when you're on parade, but actually how often do you need to be on parade? And I think some of those cultural structures that we have all sought comfort from in the past may actually be inhibitors for the progress we need to make in the future. And it's in that place almost that people like me have to have the courage to let go, because of course the structure that got me to where I am is probably not the structure that's going to get the person who's joined the Royal Navy today and will lead it in 30 years' time. In fact, I'd be horrified if they followed the same career path and it got them to the same place, because it shows that we haven't broken out of the last century.
Interesting, thank you. A question in the front row. If we get the microphone back to the front, please. Thank you. And then I'll come to you over there next. Thank you.
Thank you. Daniel Tarshish, Improbable Defence. In that vein, there's something about, you talked about rat catchers, you talked about regulators, you talked about the relationships between established primes and SMEs like Improbable. And there's something about how we incentivize decision-making, whether it's around risk or opportunity. And in particular, if we make mistakes, whether we attach blame and shame to mistakes or whether we associate them with learning. And I wonder if there's something in there about culturally within that is important for us to think about as we move forward, and I'd be interested in your view.
Thank you.
So I think at its heart, this is about accountability. And I absolutely recognise that in the operational space, as is often quoted, we're actually quite sophisticated in the combat and conflict space. We're quite, we're pretty sophisticated at risk judgments, and we're capable of taking bold gambles if we can see a benefit that can be accrued, and we're also capable of judicious caution where the odds are not necessarily stacked in our favour. And in the battle space, that's very natural, but there's also a recognition in the battle space that loss is an inevitability at times. When we then move into the business space, or the peacetime space, and we talk about trying to bring that same sophistication of risk management into it, the problem is that loss is not seen in the same way as an inevitability. You're held accountable to it to a punishing degree that on the battlefield may not necessarily be the case. Now, there's always a transition when you go from peace to war, that the commanders who take you into war very rarely survive those first few months, because there's a process where they've brought up the wrong sort of thinking in. But equally, when you come out the other side, quite quickly, you find yourself back in accountability. And we've got to work out at what point accountability is part of a learning organisation that is prepared to take a setback because you go forward stronger, and the person who has learned from that lesson actually becomes better at what they're doing, or that accountability is actually because someone is not capable of adapting to the new process or the new environment, and therefore needs to be moved on. And in that, I think we've got some way to go yet. You know, I contrast that difference, which is probably less accurate now, but in the US, you know, if you haven't been bankrupt once, you can't possibly have taken enough risk in the way that you're trying to drive your businesses. In the UK, it's an absolute black mark, even if the reason why your business failed were for reasons completely beyond your control. And I sometimes wonder whether we've quite got that right, frankly.
Thank you.